Good morning, folks. Actually, for me, I always forget to do this. Big DevOps smile. Woo! Thank you. Okay, so good morning, Kiev. I'm going to apologize in advance. You're going to notice me coughing a lot. I was just out surfing, and it didn't go terribly well. It's a joke back to Andrew, but that failed. That's okay. You don't make 100% of the shots you don't take, and that one. I just have some allergies, and the air is a little drier, so bear with me for a moment. So they say that behind every great man is another one. And thanks to Andrew, I hope to be that other man. So I want to thank you for being here. And again, I want to thank our organizers. They've done a fantastic job putting together a conference, especially volunteers. It's a lot like herding cats. And to have, especially their first year in a region that hasn't seen it before, they've done a remarkable job already. So this has been fantastic. So big round of applause for our organizers. And again, our sponsors. We do very much appreciate them. So, sometimes. Okay, so how many of you have never been to a DevOps Days before? Please, show of hands. That's awesome. That's like 90+% of the crowd. You're now part of a global phenomenon and a community. And that's one of the most wonderful things about it. It's a community about openness and sharing and helping each other. There are individuals who might think that you have a stupid question, but there are many more who, it's okay, you can ask the question. But you should know that DevOps Days is a conference of professionals, but it's supposed to be entertaining as well as informative. My primary role here is to entertain, and if you get something out of it, then that's so much the better. But audiences will vary in their social norms. For instance, I gave a talk a couple years ago. You want to be an agent of change, or hired to be an agent of change? Here's your helmet. I gave the talk in New York City, and then a couple weeks later in Toronto. I thought I was bombing horribly in Toronto because I got a couple chuckles here and there. Turns out that's uproarious laughter. So if you're comfortable laughing, if you find something funny, that's okay. If you're bored to tears, go ahead and speak with some of our sponsors, or start an impromptu session. I'll get the message that I suck today, if enough of you leave. But that's a long way of saying that if you find something funny, react how comes naturally to you. You don't need to be reserved. This isn't academic. Hi, I'm Waldo, and this is Fear and Loathing in Systems Administration. But first, a little housekeeping, like that. This talk isn't endorsed by anyone. This is me. I'm just a boy standing in front of his community, asking it to make things a little bit better. I will take questions after the show if we have time. But if you really want to talk, I encourage you to propose an open space, because if you have a question, chances are other people will have a very similar question, and we could just have a discussion. My only rule is that if you must heckle, where are you, Andrew? Thank you. If you must heckle, you have to be funnier than I am, because I have the mic. So what I need to know now is who you are. We did first-time DevOps Days attendees. How many of you, by show of hands, are systems engineers or administrators, operations, network, storage, like those core back-end things? Show of hands. Systems people? Wow, awesome. That's like a lot. I know you have my back. How many of you are software engineering, development? Okay, right on. DBA, security, Maybe hardcore networking, okay? A noticeable majority, well, minority rather. How about management or product? I like to call that people who used to be useful, but now do other things. You know, a few of you, yeah, right on. How about other business? Maybe not technical, or just differently technical. This could be design, it could be financial, legal, sales, marketing, HR, administrative. Did I skip QA? I'm sorry, QA. I'm going to come back to that because that's really important. I can't believe I took that off there. Okay, so we don't have any of the businessy side things, which is kind of unfortunate, but not unsurprising. Who else did I miss? Did anybody have a role that I didn't kind of cover? Evangelist? I think I have that covered, but yeah. So Dan, my esteemed friend and peer, we work for the same company on the same team. We were both evangelists at Datadog, who is hiring. I don't know if we could, yeah. Anyway, so given the name of the conference, you might be expecting to hear lovely stories about sunshine and rainbows and happiness and cooperation and so on from all of our favorite companies. These are fantastic because they give hope and a goal, but they seldom describe the struggle of the path. They describe their now and what it was like before, and maybe a few key steps on how to get there. But there's some missing steps. In fact, there's usually enough content for a DevOps drinking game. Which Andrew covered quite a few of, so I'm glad I didn't play this morning. So instead of talking about the glorious utopia that is the DevOps promised land, I'm going to talk about the first steps along that path. Now, one final point. I'm going to be moving quickly. So here's the safe word for my talk. I can't move. If at any time you're feeling overwhelmed, please say the safe word clearly, and we'll take a break. You know, I just realized that in America, this is a huge joke because that doesn't mean anything to us, but some of you may actually know what that is. So that's a real word to some of you? Oh boy. All right, let's get on with the show. If there's one thing that I want you to get out of this talk, it's that you need to remember that the people that you interact with are in fact people. When you have conflict with people at work, it's likely because your incentives and theirs are in conflict. If there's a second thing that I want teams to adopt, it's that responsibility doesn't end when a product hits production. When it goes live, that's not when responsibility ends. Responsibility ends when it leaves production. When you retire something, that's when you don't need to care anymore. I wish I had a better attribution for this, but I don't. But there's a Chinese proverb that says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. This is killing me. But the number of times that I've heard this phrase, DevOps doesn't work, it's amazing. And the best thing about this phrase is that the people who say it are completely right, if for very wrong reasons. Now, typically, who says this? SysAdmins, of which I come from. This is my background. This is how I started in tech. Now, I'm going to use the term sysadmins as shorthand for a very broad group. The people in this group have very widely varying titles, but it's most commonly a combination of systems, network or operations, combined with administrator, engineer, technician, or analyst. So, a mess. And even while the suite of names has changed, the actual jobs day to day can vary so widely that the jobs are essentially incompatible. In some companies, they have the best computers, but in others, they'll have the worst. Their workplace probably isn't very nice. In my career, it's been oddly consistent that their offices have no natural light, usually shoved down in a basement somewhere in a fluorescent lit hell. If there's a pager rotation, they're on it. If there isn't a rotation, they're on call all the time. Their work is largely invisible until something fails, in which case it's the talk of the town. This is unintentional thought leadership, because I forgot this one was in here, but I like to use this to define operations. And this is what their typical day looks like. But if one word could be used to describe these people, I think we could agree that that word would be cynical. So who here had a product launch and there was a party to celebrate our success? Quick show of hands. We did a thing, woo! Did you ever notice sometimes, especially if it was rushed out the door or like crammed together, shoved it into that box at the last second, got it out the door, maybe not everybody involved is at that party. Maybe your QA and your ops folks are still at their desk cleaning up after the success. Or maybe they're there, but they're huddled around their laptops in a corner. Did you remember to invite them? So you have a kickoff meeting, and you start seeing a bunch of new faces around. And that's when you find out a new project has begun. It's been announced. So when you ask, who's going to support this new project, the new workload? Well, you get a blank response saying, well, you are. The of course may or may not be spoken, but it's there. When asked how many people you get to hire to help bear that new load, you'll hear, oh, come on, it won't be that much more work. Oh, sorry, there wasn't anything left in the budget. Or a variation of the team player or good soldier speech. They might be the only people who see a lot more effort going into building new things than running the things that are, making money now. Ask them if they've ever had a training or a conference budget rejected out of hand, or because another group used up all the budget before you even found out about it. These people probably have a working knowledge of a half dozen programming languages, but they most often think in something like shell. They probably know at least three ways of testing if a port is open, and probably have a soft spot in their heart for a couple of specific shell commands, like netcat. Netcat's awesome. Ask me about netcat. They have no patience for people who won't lift a finger to help themselves, and they may have seen or participated in a DevOps culture shift that largely consists of a team rename. How much of this is sounding familiar? Yes. Thank you. Totally anonymous person. Maybe they were even helpfully suggested that they install some config management or monitoring so we can do the DevOps now, or so we can agile. But when they hear DevOps or agile, what they think is, well, let's take those same people who can't handle a planned release schedule or make whatever effort they need to squeak by the change board requirements. Let's give them unfettered access to production, because clearly, I'm not paged often enough. I like GIFs, by the way. When bringing a problem to management or the engineering group, they're very often likely to be told, but that means that the developers will have to do additional work. Can't you just deal with it? You've been taking care of it so far. Can't you just keep? But what they hear is, I think the engineer's time is more valuable than yours. Now, you knew this meme was coming, but it's so pervasive because the attitude is prevalent. It's everywhere. Now, it's not intentional, but actions speak louder than words. And when all of these things that I'm talking about become patterns, see if you don't start turning cynical. Now, how do you maintain sanity in the face of increasing job scope, increasing demand for velocity, and little hope for an effective new hire count? Not to mention juggling the existing volume of requests just to keep the machine running. Please note, I'm not saying just. There's nothing just about this situation. There's nothing simple about any of it, and justice hasn't been seen in the long term. These changes are difficult, and they will take work, and will require convincing other teams to join in your cause, to get them on your side. But the first step towards getting help is admitting that you have a problem. The problem isn't technical, it's almost entirely social. Now, because sysadmins are typically responsible for the environment, the easiest way to assure that state is preserved and that's stable is to lock everybody else from it. Now, this helps with the goal of keeping out unexpected changes, sometimes, but it has a number of side effects. First, a kind of learned helplessness has set into the environment. Your customers, your teammates, became so used to being hands-off that they don't know what a reasonable level of effort is for, or have reasonable expectations for how long anything will take. Some teams settle on a pattern of hands-off production, but you have access to staging, but this is fraught with peril. Since they're uncomfortable making any changes at all changes end up being made by your sysadmins, your ops people. Their time ends up being consumed by performing lots of low-value tasks. And the most common problem that stems from this is configuration drift. This is when you have different settings in one environment than the others. Because when the cost to discover what production looks like is high by interacting with those cynical, bitter people, it's more likely that people will either use defaults, make assumptions, or just use the same configs that works in their IDE. So, the good old works on my machine. Now, this is a problem well solved by config management and tools, but you still need to be willing to trust your peers and give them access. If you want to be part of the process of validating changes, you can put in place a pull request or a code review workflow. And this is something that your software engineering peers should be well accustomed to. Granting access to see existing configs and the ability to propose changes also shares responsibility for your team's environments and contributes to their feelings of ownership. Whereas denying colleagues the ability to make effective changes contributes more to the configuration drift or the learned helplessness. You need to stop feeding the machine. Your value isn't doing the work, but rather making the decision to do the work. Now, damn it, Schaefer. I'll be the first to say that automating all the things is a flawed goal. It's usually said in the context of a project, rather than a part of a philosophy of continual improvement. While I agree that everything should be automated, not everything should be automatic. Decision-making is complex, and attempting to codify, to draw out all the possible decision-making points is a fantastic way to make yourself insane or prove that you are insane. Okay, not that funny. But you have to break down the steps and iterate over time. Now, you shouldn't have to engage in an automation project to improve your environment. Build it into your schedule time to solve discovered problems. Pick something that's rough, manual, and repeatable, and remove a small piece of friction. And then you move on to the next one. Improve over time. See, an automation project, my friends, is ocean boiling, if I've ever seen it. Does that phrase mean anything here? Boiling the ocean? Okay. So, the ocean is a huge body of water, and it takes a long time to boil like a pot of water if you're sitting there. Now, if you want things warm, you should do them in small chunks over time. Because if you make the scope of your project too big, like the ocean, and you're never going to get done. And if you only work on small pieces here and there, you're just not going to get any sense of accomplishment or meaningful movement forward. Ideally, you have time blocked out for continuous improvement. Now, and if not, create a meeting or create a weekly project to do so, and use this time to review what's happened over the past week or two, or sprint or whatever, and pick some issues to resolve and fix them, and make that habit. Build it in. Whoa! There's all my misclicks. There we go. So whatever you don't automate must be documented. Now, trying to recognize whether documenting or automating takes more time or provides more value, that's a skill that takes time takes practice. But sometimes documentation is better served by what I like to call executable documentation. Write a script. If the steps are simple enough, just start building it into code and making that its own documentation. But beyond the typical benefits of docs, they also serve as functional requirements for when it can be automated. Because your documentation is up to date, right? Right? Next, we need to make sure that you and the business agree on why you're here. You should attempt to pick up the pieces of your work and attempt to describe them. And a way to make this a fun exercise is to use job titles, use alternate job titles to describe your role. Are you a code cleric? Are you a release ranger? Are you an internet plumber? How much legacy system spelunking do you have to do? Cave exploration. Could you describe part of your role as a production customs official? Are you the gatekeeper to production? And if so, are you actually equipped to do that? Here's a quick test. If you say, no, that can't go, do you get overridden? More importantly, is this what you want to do? Before you can ask for help, you will need to prepare. Most SysAdmin teams do not have a healthy relationship with the rest of the business. Which one? Oh, yeah. You will need time to initiate the healing. Take somebody to lunch. Ask questions and listen to the answers. It's not time to defend yourself or your team. It's time to find out what the business needs from somebody else's perspective. Ask what they think your team's role is toward gaining that success. Ask what they think your team does well and where there are gaps between where you are now and excellence. Now, in having these conversations, you're going to recognize their words, but you need to go out of your way to speak them. To communicate your message, you need to meet them on their turf. This may seem terribly unfair. Now, why can't they meet me on my terms? But I'm guessing this hasn't been working out so well for you so far. Not only do you need to use their language, but you need to communicate over their medium. It's probably not IRC. And writing in an email is a really great way to get it ignored. If you're speaking to management, be prepared to write a presentation. Executives especially like to see a slide deck. It doesn't have to be slick, but it should probably have, don't put sounds or much in the way of transitions, but a presentation can help lay the groundwork for meaningful conversation. But now that you've described your role, we also need to describe everything that you support. It's entirely possible, and likely even, that the people and teams that you take care of, that rely on you, don't actually know what you're responsible for. And it could be argued that most of them shouldn't need to know. But if you've been saying no to protect yourself, it's a sign that you're significantly overextended. You need to have a real discussion with your leadership about your role, your scope, and your staffing. In order to have this discussion, you need to prepare. You need to come up with a fairly comprehensive list of all the products and teams that you support. There's a list of every team, their products, the components and tasks that belong to you for each of them. And don't forget the components that nobody owns. but somehow you wind up being on the hook to fix. CI, your Jenkins or Bamboo, source code management, like if you're running your own Git, ticketing like Jira or whatever, your project management and the wiki tools. These all seem to be common examples of tools that are core business products. They are necessary for the daily operation, but nobody really owns. They just got put there, and it's now your responsibility. But wait, are you also responsible for directory services? Or the virtualization platform? Maybe mail and chat and phones. Sometimes workstation purchasing and provisioning, and printers. Do you manage the storage, the networking? All of this stuff is important. Seriously, get into detail. This isn't the time to skimp. Every app. Now, here's the thing. Wow, that goes over big in America. Okay. Your leadership may not know what LDAP is, but they'll understand if nobody can log into their machines and they can't grab information to pull reports. Oh, and by the way, because nothing can log in, nothing gets deployed. No new code deployments happen. Are you sure that you understand what the company's goals are, and your chief executives at the company, do they agree with your take on it? What do you need to succeed? How much more staff do you need? And what tooling and equipment would help you achieve your goals so the company can achieve its? And are your incentives aligned with your goals? Do your incentives conflict with other groups? Now, in order to have meaningful discussions with these people who aren't necessarily technical, you need to be able to relate to a language that they speak. Now, regardless of team duties, the lingua franca of most teams is money. Everything, as engineers, most of us prefer to think in terms of the tech itself. But in order to describe an impact, everybody can translate or compile down to money. It's a difficult and uncomfortable habit to get into, but it's really necessary, and it's very helpful. I encourage you to consider the components of a cost that goes into every incident or task. What's the cost of a main site outage or a feature outage? How much revenue does this given feature bring in? Does the amount of money and effort we're putting into any given project match its value? Further, you need to describe how different systems relate. It doesn't have to be terribly detailed, but describe the features that components rely on, components X, Y, and Z of your infrastructure. Why does it matter that you do this piece of maintenance? What will be the cost if our storage cluster breaks? How much would it cost to invest in improving the automation around it, including delegation or self-service tools to your peers? Describe how doing this maintenance work reduces your context switching, because your management should know context switching is the biggest productivity killer ever. What about unplanned outages or the loss of reputation to your company? These have value, and you need to draw attention to those things. So how can you delegate more to your peers, and what benefits come from their increased agency? What do you need to achieve to get those enabling technologies? So again, you're going to draw the lines from LDAP to your storage cluster, to your CI tool, to testing code, to releasing artifacts to production. Now show all the other systems that have similar dependencies. And once the picture emerges that showing how everything is reliant on unexciting things like LDAP or your storage cluster and that janky collection of Perl and Angry shell scripts, these things that keep everything running, realization will begin to dawn on the value that the operations group brings and the importance. Congratulations, you've now just effectively communicated value. Now, if they claim that they're doing agile, but they can't do continuous delivery, they're not really doing agile. And the whole point of that framework is to improve delivery of value to the customers and the business. And these are your gaps. Now, it's not a DevOps talk unless we have some Conway's Law. So when people read this, they usually think of an org chart. Now, you see how slick and smooth those lines are. This can help make sense of the company when you start exceeding Dunbar's number. Dunbar's number is a cognitive feature of how many relationships how many people you can know and the relationships that you can maintain in your head. Now, don't confuse a reporting structure with a communication structure. And it's communication that's the key. If you don't know about Conway's Law, you'll be at the mercy of people who really care about that org chart. But if you and your people have regular communication with those people outside of your reporting structure, those are communication structures. Lunches and friendships are much more effective than status meeting. Pollinate. I firmly believe that a key to making business work better and improving the life of operations is the pager. Are sysadmins held responsible for apps written by other people? Who gets paged when the app goes down? It's probably not the same people who wrote it. Well, how does that make sense? Get your engineers, your developers on call for their apps. Sysadmins aren't off the hook. They get escalated too. Developers can triage and troubleshoot their own apps much more readily because they wrote the app. They already broke a bunch of stuff that didn't work on their machine before they could say, it works on my machine. And if you call yourself a full stack developer, excellent. You have no excuse not to carry a pager. But they get to call in the cavalry when they get stuck. They don't need to know everything about the systems. And they don't need to resolve everything. When a fault occurs and they need help, they stay on the call and they pair with you as you diagnose, troubleshoot, and resolve. But they can help get an initial triage much more effectively. That way they don't need to escalate to the systems people for this failure the next time it happens, assuming it's going to happen again. And they can start to collaborate with the operations folks and their peers on how to make more permanent fixes. Stop, listen, and collaborate.
Great.
I don't think that's mine. I totally did that. So when teams aren't responsible for their products, when they aren't paged when it fails, they're numb to the pain that they inflict. And it's not that they're trying to cause pain, they just don't feel it. Now, it's especially easy to argue this for teams that proclaim that they use agile development methods. They claim they want continuous feedback, but there's no more visceral feedback than being waken up by a pager in the middle of the night. It's almost inevitable that you'll hear, we can't interrupt our developers, as if it makes sense to interrupt somebody else. And even being aware of the pain, saying how many times, I got paged like 6 times last night. This can elicit sympathy, but that's a far cry from the experience of being paged yourself. Now, here's another thing. I know you don't want to be woken up at 3 a.m. because of something you wrote. How do you think your ops team feels about being woken up by something they didn't write? So this is what that list of responsibilities is for. Asking each team to take responsibility for their own products, you'll still likely have a very hefty list of things that you are still on call for. Now, as this list of responsibility emerges, now's the time to point at your staffing numbers. Now, this may be just a matter of the places that I've worked, but I've never seen a developer to operations role ratio of less than 5 to 1. In most places, it's much higher. I would say 10 to 1 is probably average, and I've seen far worse. But by adding these teams to their own pager rotations, they're drastically reducing the load and burnout potential on their ops peers. By not adding the engineering groups to pager rotations, they're complicit in the burnout of operations. Now, it's no secret that sysadmins have a reputation for saying no. The people who are asking for things, they're not trying to make the sysadmins group life worse. They're just trying to get their work done. Now, they may not know what a simple request involves, or that it might not even be necessary. But by not having responsibility aligned with authority, the sysadmin group may be saddled with the pain of other people's wishes just because there's a lack of understanding. You know that fulfilling the request is going to cause you pain, so you understandably, I don't want to be hurt, so no, I'm not doing that. What often happens next is that the people making the requests escalate until they hit somebody sufficiently important enough to override you. And this is the basis for why sysadmins feel steamrolled by everybody else, and everybody else feels held hostage by the sysadmins. But all hope is not lost. So stop saying no. Take a cue from improv comedy. Nothing kills an improv group's flow more than somebody saying, no, I have an idea, let's do, no. They say yes, and. I'm going to go with that, and let's skew the direction a little bit. But since yes and doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us, use yes, but. Yes, but is very powerful, and it can get you help. Yes, I can set this up for you, but I don't have the capacity to run it for you. What happened there? You agreed that their request is reasonable. You set expectations for the level of support that you can give. And you, at this point, the requester is left with several options to continue the conversation. For instance, they might have hiring recs that they haven't been able to fill yet. Perhaps some of their engineers join your team as part of a rotation or a lateral move, maybe a slight change of job for a while. They'll need mentorship and training, but cross-training is hugely powerful. Think about the best engineers you know, whether they're from an operations background or a software development background. The best ones I know have a deep working knowledge of how things work, but they can also write new applications and effectively debug and make more resilient existing applications. It's a force multiplier, and this kind of thing sets precedent. Maybe they take responsibility for the thing. They run it, they get paid for it. Now, of course, you're still going to have to be an escalation point to assist when it fails, but it's their product. Again, this sets precedent. Because most sysadmins are stuck doing tasks that they provide very little value to just because they have access. Now, in my mind, there's a perfect example called playing telephone. And when I say this, I'm talking about a situation where, let's say, developers writing an app, and maybe it's in staging, but they don't have access to it. And they want some logs. So you go get them the log and provide it to them. No, not that log. It's in this other file. I'm not seeing what I'm looking for. Could you check over here and look for something that says something like blah, 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 and so on and so forth. Now, I don't know what you're hoping to prevent by restricting access. But if this scenario ever happens to you, you are providing negative value. Again, let's try to remember that your peers are not out to get you. They can probably be trusted to be reasonable human beings if you meet them halfway. And with that framework in mind, it's time that you demonstrate some trust and delegate to them. Give them access. Now, your value is not your logging credentials. Otherwise, you're just a very poorly implemented terminal as a service. Even Even better than giving direct access is tooling. Logging into a server for most things should be an anti-pattern for the vast majority of work, especially now. You need some better tooling. So with the example of logging, let's talk tooling for a moment. So logging into boxes to get logs is just plain dumb. Sure, you could wrap a tail command into a rundeck job, but let's centralize that instead. Now, syslog is better than nothing, but not by much. Shipping logs is easy, but consuming them with syslog, making them useful isn't all that great. Batteries are not included. Now, if your company wants to spend the money on Splunk, then I encourage that. Splunk is fantastic. It's going to be expensive, so you're probably not going to be able to spend the money to get everything in there. So there's going to be confusion on what is stored where. If you're going to do Splunk, go all or nothing. I'm a big fan of Elk. That's Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. It's fallen out of favor, and there are a lot of SaaS companies that are doing it better now in Datadog's hiring. But Elk is free as in beer, and it's very featureful. If you don't want to run it yourself, again, there are plenty Elk in the cloud services. But take your centralized logging of choice and provide your peers with access. Give them the URL and the credentials, and maybe point them at some docs. But one tip in this particular category I can give you is early on, get those teams to start shipping logs in like an object format, like JSON. You don't want to be sending syslog. Because if not, you're going to have to write a grok filter for them, and that's not fun. It's a really awful regex that's going to make you miserable. This is a very specific example from my past, probably about 5 years ago, where we defined a log provider in Chef for our applications. And the grok filter you'll see is right on screen. There, in the red. Now, if somebody is being stubborn about changing their log type, that's fine. Fine. No, it's fine. They can write that themselves. But look, you don't need to run all the things. And if somebody asks you to run this command for me, maybe you need to put a button on it. Rundeck, I think, is a fantastic tool to just put a button on things. It's pretty easy to make highly available. You can tie it into your LDAP for credentialing and managing permissions. And by shipping its logs, again, to Elk or whatever, you get auditing of who did what and when. Now, in the case that you have some data that capital M must be restricted, you need to isolate those cases from the rest of your environment. Just because you shouldn't have to restrict everything just because one thing needs to be restricted. So we have to ask, why would you have to deploy other people's code? That's just terminal as a service for a very specific task. Do you really provide any value in that activity? If the deployment doesn't go well, you're guaranteed to be launching into another game of telephone. It helps if I step into it, apparently. Now, what if you make it easy for the product team to do their own deployments? Empower them with trust and tooling, making it easy for them to do the right thing. Give them tooling to see that the deployment succeeded. Logs are a start, but metrics dashboards that show changes and their different performance characteristics and error rates will make it plain to see, hey, I did a deployment. Is it working? You tell me. This freedom doesn't come free. Providing tooling doesn't absolve the development teams of the need to communicate. In fact, it's much more likely they're going to have to communicate more. They'll need to be watching those dashboards and their logs to see for themselves the success of their delivery. Now, I say they a lot in this talk. And that's because by default, most organizations are set up to have a strong us versus them culture. It's only natural for them to be an us and a them. Well, it may not be my job to do to do a particular thing, it's our job to ensure that our team and our company are successful. Now, while this may sound like a bunch of happy-go-lucky, tree-hugging pop psychology nonsense, and it kind of is, the goal here is to help you and your beleaguered sysadmins to get the help that you need, to improve the capabilities of your business, and to have a better life. If I may be permitted one final thing, this pun works so much better in America. The psychological damage done to our operations folks by their peers can make us bitter and cynical. I encourage my people to see that they are not trying to make your life more difficult. It's much more likely that responsibility and authority are not aligned. And I encourage you to take steps to make your lives better. It may seem like the onus here is on the part of the sysadmins, the operations folks. They're keeping the plate spinning, and much of the work here described here is on them, and that's a fair point. We sysadmins have to put in the effort to make a better life for ourselves, because the way we've been working historically clearly hasn't been working out. There is so much more to this topic, particularly to the shift away from system to a systems team supporting a bunch of projects, to a series of largely self-sustaining product teams, project versus product. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in a lightning space, but how your company wants, most of the time, what a company really wants is they want to write a product and get it out there. They want a PaaS, a platform as a service. But a lot of teams seem to be determined to write their own PaaS. And it's usually very half-assed. It's very custom and specific and brittle. But this talk will have to wait for later. Now, so when somebody says DevOps doesn't work, they're absolutely correct. DevOps is a concept, a philosophy, and a professional movement based on the trust and collaboration among teams to align them to business needs. A concept doesn't do work, and a philosophy doesn't meet goals. People do. So please remember, just like Soylent Green, DevOps is made of people. Now, I'd like to take a moment to thank my editor. This was originally written for SysAdmin a couple years ago. Sean Moten, he was amazingly helpful in the original article. And again, thanks to our DevOps Days organizers and our sponsors and the DevOps community at large, which you all, and technical or not, your peers are now a part of. Thank you for being so sharing and supportive. And as your speaker, I advise you to take one antagonist, one company credit card, and 2 lunches. Let's go plant some trees. With that, thank you, and welcome to DevOps.
Thank you, Waldo.